The stagecoach lurched over the frozen ruts of Sagebrush Hollow's main street, wheels creaking like a weary sigh. Clara Hensley gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles pale beneath worn gloves. The winter wind slipped through the cracked window, stinging her cheeks and tugging at the loose strands of her chestnut hair. She'd pinned it tightly that morning, hoping to look respectable, but the journey from Steedy Lewis had unraveled more than her bun. Her heart, too, felt frayed, its threads pulled thin by the letter crumpled in her pocket, a promise broken before she'd even set foot in this town. The driver hollered, and the coach shuddered to a stop outside a sagging boarding house. Clara stepped down, her boots crunching into snow-dusted mud. Her gray shawl, stitched with care, but fraying at the edges, clung to her shoulders against the chill. She scanned the street, a general store with frost-etched windows, a saloon spilling laughter and smoke, and faces hard, curious, already judging peering from doorways. She was no stranger to stares. Back in Missouri, they'd called her cursed for birthing 3 daughters, each one a fresh wound to her husband's pride. When he died, the whispers turned to shunning. The letter from her cousin in Sagebrush had been her lifeline. Come west, Clara. Start anew. My husband knows a man seeking a wife. Now, she stood before the boarding house, clutching her valise. The door swung open, and her cousin, Margaret, appeared, face pinched, eyes darting. Clara, she said, voice low, he's changed his mind. Says 3 girls is too much. Margaret's gaze flicked to the townsfolk watching. I'm sorry, you can't stay with us. Folks talk. Clara's chest tightened, the cold air sharper now, slicing her lungs. She wanted to ask why, to beg for the warmth of family, but pride sealed her lips. She nodded once, jaw set, and turned away. The street stretched long and empty, snow swirling like ghosts. She was alone again, her daughters' faces left with a kind neighbor back east burning in her mind. The world felt vast and cruel, but Clara straightened her spine. She'd survived worse. She'd survived this too. Clara trudged through Sagebrush Hollow's snow-dusted streets, her valise heavy in her hand, the weight of rejection heavier still. The wind howled, carrying the scent of pine and coal smoke, and her shawl did little to shield her from the bite of late winter. Her cousin's words echoed folks' talk, and the truth of them stung like ice against her skin. She'd come seeking a new start, but this town felt no kinder than the one she'd left. The boarding house had no rooms, the innkeeper's eyes narrowing at her worn dress and solitary state. No credit, he'd said, turning away. She found shelter in a sagging lean-to behind the livery stable, its walls patched with warped boards that let in slivers of cold. The stableman, a gruff old man with a limp, took her last coins for a week's stay, muttering about no trouble. Clara set her valise on the straw-strewn floor, the musty scent mingling with the faint sweetness of hay. She sat on an overturned crate, her hands trembling as she unpinned her shawl. The fabric, once her mother's, was soft from years of wear, its stitches a map of her endurance. She wrapped it tighter, as if it could hold her together. In the silence, her thoughts turned to her girls Leela, Ruth, and tiny Hannah, their laughter a distant warmth. She'd promised them a better life, but now, with no kin to claim her and no roof to call her own, doubt crept in like the chill through the boards. She pressed her palms to her eyes, refusing tears. Crying wouldn't mend this. She'd learned that long ago, when her husband's fists had bruised more than her body, when the town's whispers had cut deeper than his blows. Clara rose, brushing straw from her skirt. The lean-to was no home, but it was a start. She'd faced worse hunger, loss, the weight of being too much for a world that wanted her small. Tomorrow, she'd find work, sewing, baking, anything to keep her promise to her daughters. The wind rattled the boards, but Clara stood firm, her breath steadying. This was her new beginning, however cold, however hard. She'd carve it out herself. Dawn broke over Sagebrush Hollow with a reluctant light, the sun filtering through heavy clouds to cast pale shadows on the snow. Clara rose from her makeshift bed of straw and blankets, her body aching from the cold that had seeped into her bones overnight. She smoothed her dress, the fabric stiff with frost, and stepped out into the crisp air. The town was stirring, horses nickering in the livery, smoke curling from chimneys, but she moved with purpose, her chin lifted against the invisible weight of eyes that might already be upon her. She started at the general store, knocking softly on the back door. The proprietor, a weary woman named Mrs. Harlan, peered out with narrowed eyes. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp as a needle. "Work," Clara replied evenly. I can sew, mend, bake, anything to earn my keep, Mrs. Harlan's gaze swept over her, lingering on the faded bruises that still shadowed Clara's cheek from her husband's final rage. Whispers had already spread about the woman with 3 girls, no man, arriving unclaimed. Folks say you're trouble, she muttered, but handed Clara a basket of torn linens. Mend these by noon. If they're good, maybe more. Clara nodded, taking the work without argument. She found a quiet corner in the lean-to, threading her needle by the dim light of a lantern. The thread slipped through fabric like a quiet promise, each stitch pulling together what was frayed. As the morning wore on, she ventured to the bakery, offering to knead dough for scraps of bread. The baker, a burly man with flour-dusted arms, grunted his assent but watched her warily, as if expecting her to falter. By afternoon, the townsfolk's judgments came in murmurs. At the market stall where she bartered mended shirts for a few potatoes, a cluster of women whispered, 3 girls? No wonder she's alone. Curse that one. Their eyes bored into her back, heavy with pity laced in scorn. Clara felt the sting, a familiar ache that echoed her old life, but she refused to bow. She baked a simple pie from scavenged apples, the scent of cinnamon and crust filling the lean-to, a small act of defiance against the emptiness. Evening fell, and Clara sat by her lantern, fingers sore from the day's labor. Her earnings were meager, a few coins, a loaf of bread, but they were hers. The wind whispered through the boards, carrying the distant howl of a coyote, but Clara's resolve burned steady. She was building, stitch by stitch, a life from the ruins. No one would break her again. The general store in Sagebrush Hollow was a haven of scents: leather, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of molasses barrels stacked against the walls. Clara stepped inside, the bell tinkling softly above the door, her basket of mended goods tucked under her arm. It had been a week since her arrival, and she'd pieced together a fragile routine, sewing for Mrs. Harlan, baking for the bakery. Each task a thread binding her to this place. The early spring thaw had begun, turning the streets to mud that clung to her boots, but the air held a promise of green beneath the lingering chill. She approached the counter, laying out the repaired linens with care. Mrs. Harlan nodded curtly, counting out coins, but Clara's gaze drifted to the man browsing the shelves nearby. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face framed by a neatly trimmed beard streaked with gray. His hands, callous from ranch work, held a sack of flour, but his eyes, deep brown, steady, met hers for a moment, not with the sharp scrutiny she'd grown used to, nor the pity that made her skin crawl. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like recognizing a fellow traveler on a long road. His name was Elias Thorne, the townsfolk said, a widower who ran a ranch on the outskirts, tending cattle and fields alone since his wife's passing 5 years back. He rarely spoke more than necessary, his silence a shield against the world's noise. As Clara turned to leave, he cleared his throat softly. Those stitches, he said, voice low and gravelly, nodding to the linens. Fine work, neat as any I've seen. Clara paused, her fingers tightening on the basket. Words like that were rare. Most saw her labor as mere necessity, not skill. Thank you, she replied, meeting his gaze. There was no probing in his eyes, no questions about her past or her bruises fading like old shadows. Just respect, plain and unadorned. He set the flour on the counter and reached for a bolt of fabric nearby, his movements deliberate. Winter's easing, he murmured, almost to himself. Ground softening for planting. It wasn't conversation, not really, just an observation, shared in the quiet space between them. Clara nodded, the scent of fresh cotton mingling with the store's warmth. For the first time in Sagebrush, she felt seen, not judged. As she stepped back into the muddy street, the mud sucking at her boots, a small spark of warmth lingered. Elias Thorne had noticed her not as a broken woman, but as one who mended what was torn. The days lengthened in Sagebrush Hollow, spring yielding to the first blush of summer, with wildflowers dotting the hillsides like scattered stitches on a vast quilt. The air hummed with warmth, carrying the scent of blooming sage and fresh-turned earth, a gentle reminder that even hardened ground could soften. Clara's room above the bakery had become a haven of small comforts, a windowsill, garden sprouting from Elias's gifted seeds, their green shoots unfurling like tentative hopes. Her work continued, sewing hems, baking loaves, but the quiet exchanges with Elias had woven a subtle pattern into her life, each meeting a thread pulling them closer without words to define it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Clara stood in her tiny kitchen, flour dusting her apron. She'd gathered berries from the outskirts, their tart sweetness a rare indulgence, and kneaded dough with careful hands, shaping it into a modest tart. It wasn't grand, no elaborate lattice or spices from afar, but each fold held her intent. A thank you, unspoken, for the man who saw her strength amid the town's whispers. The oven's heat flushed her cheeks, mingling with the berry scent that filled the air, evoking memories of baking for her girls, of creating warmth from scant ingredients. With the tart cooled and wrapped in a clean cloth, Clara made her way to the general store just before closing. Elias was there as she'd hoped, tallying supplies at the counter, his broad frame silhouetted against the fading light. He looked up as she entered, his eyes softening in that quiet way of his. "Evening, Clara," he said, voice steady like the ranch's enduring fences. She set the bundle down, her fingers lingering on the cloth. "For you?" she murmured, meeting his gaze. No explanations, no tales of her past or the risks of this gesture. Just the offering, heartfelt and handmade, a risk she took in the silence between them. Her heart quickened, the vulnerability sharp as a needle's prick. Giving meant opening, and she'd been closed for so long. Elias unwrapped the cloth slowly, his calloused hands gentle, revealing the golden crust and glistening berries. A faint smile touched his lips, not broad, but deep, warming his features like sunlight on soil. He nodded once, eyes holding hers with gratitude that needed no voice. "Smells like summer," he said softly, the words carrying layers of appreciation, of recognition for the care she'd poured in. He broke off a small piece, offering it back to her first, a silent sharing that bridged the counter between them. As Clara left, the tart's warmth echoed in her chest, a small flame against old shadows. Elias watched her go, the gesture settling in him like roots taking hold, deepening the unspoken affection that bloomed in the quiet spaces they shared. Summer enveloped Sagebrush Hollow in a golden haze, the sun baking the earth into a warm, yielding loam that promised abundance. The annual town fair bustled along the main street, stalls laden with jars of preserves, quilts draped like colorful banners, and the scent of fried dough mingling with hay and horse sweat. Laughter rang out from children chasing hoops while fiddles tuned up for the evening dance. Clara walked among the crowd, her basket hooked over her arm, filled with pies she'd baked apple and berry, their crusts flaky and golden, symbols of the quiet harvest she'd reaped from her perseverance. She'd sewn a new dress for the occasion, simple calico with threads she'd chosen carefully, each stitch a reaffirmation of her worth. The whispers still followed her like shadows. That woman with the girls, alone too long, but Clara held her head high, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, the fabric soft against her skin. A reminder of the strength she'd stitched into her days. Elias appeared at her side as she neared the pie table, his presence steady as an oak in the shifting crowd. He carried a small crate of vegetables from his ranch, carrots and beans, earthy and robust, grown from the seeds they'd spoken of months ago. "Fair day," he murmured, setting the crate down and glancing at her with that quiet respect that had become their shared language. They stood together, ranging her pies beside his produce, their hands brushing in the task fleeting touches that spoke volumes in silence. The townsfolk noticed, eyes darted, murmurs swelled like a summer breeze rustling leaves. Margaret, her cousin, hovered nearby, lips pursed. "Folks are talking," she whispered to Clara, but Clara only nodded, unflinching. She wouldn't hide. She'd built this life, pie by pie, stitch by stitch. Elias felt the stares too, the weight of judgment on a widower daring to stand by a cursed woman. But he straightened, his gaze meeting Clara's with unwavering warmth. "Your peace'll win," he said softly, the words carrying subtext of belief in her, not just her baking. A child ran by, knocking into the table, and Elias steadied it with one hand, his other lingering near hers, a gesture of protection born from respect, not pity. As the judge awarded her pie a blue ribbon, the crowd's whispers peaked, but Clara accepted it with grace, her eyes finding Elias's amid the applause. He nodded once, pride etched in his features. In that public moment, under the summer sun, their bond transformed visible. Unyielding summer evening draped Sagebrush Hollow in a velvet hush, the sky a canvas of deepening indigo scattered with stars like scattered pins on a vast quilt. Clara sat on the porch of Elias's ranch house, the wooden planks warm from the day's sun, her shawl draped over her lap. He'd invited her for supper, a simple meal of stew and bread, shared in the quiet rhythm they'd cultivated. The ranch sprawled around them, fields golden under the fading light, the scent of hay and wildflowers mingling with the smoke from the dying fire in the pit nearby. Crickets chirped a soft serenade, and the distant low of cattle added a grounding bass to the night. Elias emerged from the house, 2 mugs of coffee in hand, steam curling like unspoken thoughts. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing a touch now familiar, laden with meaning. He settled beside her on the bench, close but not crowding, his presence a steady anchor. They sipped in silence at first, the coffee's bitterness softened by a touch of sugar, much like their lives' hard edges eased by shared moments. "You've changed things here," Elias said finally, his voice low, gravelly with emotion he rarely let surface. He stared at the fire's embers, glowing orange against the dark. "The garden, those flowers you planted, they're blooming now. Didn't think this place could hold that kind of color again." Clara turned to him, her heart quickening. The firelight danced on his face, highlighting the lines etched by years of loss and labor. She knew his story in fragments, his wife's death and childbirth, the child gone with her, leaving him to tend the ranch alone, building walls of silence. "It's just seeds," she murmured, but her words carried subtext, of growth from barren soil, of life persisting. He set his mug down, turning to face her fully. "No, Clara, it's you, coming here, with your quiet ways, your hands that mend what's torn. I've watched you not out of pity, but because you remind me what strength looks like. You carried burdens that would break most, yet you stand. 3 girls, that's not a curse. That's a gift you gave the world." His eyes held hers, deep and earnest, stripping away the layers of judgment she'd worn like armor. Tears pricked her eyes, not from pain, but from being seen truly, deeply. "I was beaten down, Elias, for being too much, for not being enough. But here, with you," she trailed off, the words heavy with vulnerability. He reached for her hand, his calluses rough against her skin, a perfect fit. "You're enough, more than. You healed something in me I thought was gone forever." The confession hung between them, intimate as a whisper. Slowly, he leaned in, their foreheads touching first, breaths mingling. Then, with full emotional surrender, his lips met hers soft, unhurried, a seal on the truths they'd unveiled. The stars above witnessed, as love bloomed fully in the quiet night. The ranch awoke under a late summer sun, its rays filtering through the leaves of the cottonwood trees that lined the path to Elias's home, now tentatively theirs. Clara stood in the garden they'd expanded together, her hands sunk into the rich soil, planting the last of the season's seeds, squash and pumpkins, symbols of harvest to come. The earth was warm beneath her fingers, yielding and fertile, much like the life she was building. The air carried the scent of ripening tomatoes and the faint tang of hay from the barn, a blend that grounded her in this new reality. Elias worked nearby, mending a section of fence that had sagged under winter's weight. His hammer struck wood in a steady rhythm, each blow deliberate, echoing the quiet commitment they'd forged. Since that night by the fire, their bond had deepened without fanfare, no grand declarations, but in shared tasks and glances that spoke of forever. He'd asked her to stay, not with words at first, but by clearing space in the house, a drawer for her things, a hook for her shawl, gestures that invited her fully into his world. "These'll grow strong," Clara said softly, patting the soil over. "A seed." She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and met his gaze across the yard. The bruises of her past had faded entirely now, replaced by the flush of purpose and belonging. Elias set down his hammer, crossing to her with that unhurried stride. He knelt beside her, his hand covering hers in the dirt, a touch rough yet tender, like the land they tended. "Like us," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken promises. "Clara, I've been thinking about your girls. There's room here for all of you. We can send for them, make this a home." Her breath caught, the words piercing the last remnants of her guarded heart. She'd written letters to her daughters, careful missives of hope, but to bring them here, to weave them into this tapestry, felt like a dream mending into truth. Tears welled, but she blinked them back, nodding. "Yes," she whispered, her fingers intertwining with his. "A family, ours." They rose together, walking the property as the sun climbed higher. Elias pointed to the porch, envisioning a swing for evenings, to the spare room, soon to hold beds for Leela, Ruth, and Hannah. Clara added her touch as a quilt she'd sew, a bookshelf for stories read aloud. No proposal in flowers or rings, but in this planning, a deep commitment sealed. He on one knee in the garden, not with words, but by planting a rosebush at her feet, its thorns a nod to trials past, its buds a promise of beauty ahead. As dusk fell, they sat on the steps, shoulders touching, the ranch settling around them. The future stretched like the fields before them, ready for sowing. Clara leaned into him, her resilience blooming into joy, their connection a quiet force shaping what was to come. Autumn winds whispered through Sagebrush Hollow, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and ripening apples, a gentle farewell to summer's warmth. The ranch had transformed into a true home, its fields harvested, barns stocked for winter, and the house alive with the laughter of Clara's daughters. Leela, Ruth, and Hannah had arrived weeks ago, their wide eyes taking in the vast skies and endless horizons, their small hands eager to help in the garden or kitchen. Elias had welcomed them without fanfare, his quiet ways earning their trust. Stitch by stitch, a carved wooden toy for Hannah, stories of the stars for Ruth, a gentle lesson in riding for Leela. The wedding was no grand affair, held in the ranch's modest parlor as golden light filtered through lace curtains Clara had sewn herself. The town preacher stood before the hearth, his words simple and true, while a handful of neighbors, those whose whispers had softened into acceptance, bore witness. Clara wore her calico dress, adorned with a shawl embroidered with wildflower patterns, each thread a symbol of the life she'd rebuilt. Elias stood tall in his best shirt, his hand steady as he slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, his eyes holding hers with the depth of shared silences. "I take you, Clara, for all that you are," he murmured, his voice low but resonant, echoing the vows they'd lived long before speaking them. She nodded, her response a soft echo. "And I you, Elias, in strength and in peace." Afterward, they gathered on the porch for a quiet feast. Pies baked with the girls' help, stew simmered over the fire, the air filled with the warmth of cinnamon and wood smoke. No raucous dance, but Elias pulled Clara close under the stars, their steps slow and intimate on the wooden planks, the girls clapping softly as fireflies danced like living embers. The town had come to see her not as ruined, but resilient. Elias had shown her that dignity was hers to claim, not another's to grant. As the night deepened, they sat together, the family whole, the ranch a sanctuary of quiet transformation. Clara leaned into Elias, her head on his shoulder, the shawl draped over them both. "You reminded me who I already was," she whispered, the words a truth etched in her heart. A woman of strength, worthy of love, blooming in the frontier's embrace. The wind carried her words into the night, sealing their peace with dignity earned and shared.